Vice President Kamala Harris choosing to skip the Israeli Prime Minister's address to Congress may suggest that there could be some daylight between her and President Biden. Well, joining me now to discuss is Middle East expert and editor-in-chief at the Foreign Desk, Lisa Daftari. Lisa, it's always a pleasure to have you. Now, Kamala Harris's decision to meet with a black sorority over one of our nation's closest allies, what message does that send to not only Israel, but also to the Middle East?
It sends a message across the world and right here at home. And this is the issue that has been lost on the last three administrations, is that there cannot be any daylight between Israel and the United States. They are our strategic partner in the Middle East. They are our security partner. And it's not just a one-way relationship. It's not just that Israel relies on the military equipment or the checks that we provide them. We rely on Israel for so many things, including jobs, including technology, including information, intelligence sharing, and much more. What's crazy about the situation is that this is Kamala Harris's first time to actually have a symbolic and meaningful role in foreign policy. Every time, you see her in previous opportunities she had, whether it was with Polish leaders or others, and she's laughing. I saw someone post something on social media last night and said, you know what, it's not right that people pick on her personality. They should really stick to the policies. That's what we should look at when we look at who we should vote for president. Those were her policies. Every time she's asked an important question, she starts laughing. No one's making fun of her personality. It's the fact that she has never, stepped up in those important moments. She is making a louder statement by not going. And it's not because she had this meeting at a sorority. She could have postponed that. It's because she didn't want to go. And it's because of pressure from left-wing groups, not Democrats, but left-wing fringe voices. And that's the danger in a Kamala Harris presidency, is that she doesn't really stand for anything other than wanting to be in the position of power. And that's really unfortunate, because there are so many well-deserving women in this country that could be the first vice president and now the first president of the United States. It's not just a superlative. She has to play the role. Something I tweeted yesterday is that it doesn't matter who's the prime minister of Israel. It doesn't matter what his or her personality is. And it doesn't matter who is the president of the United States. These two countries, they need each other, and foreign policy always will be a bipartisan issue, and it should not be forgotten by any administration.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points here, Lisa, one of which, I'd like to bring to light even more. She has every opportunity to be a leader in this situation, and she's absolutely just choosing not to. Like you said, your actions are speaking very much louder than words. And also, you have mentioned previously that the U.S. and Israel, the relationship must be ironclad, regardless of who's president, who's prime minister. Do you trust that we can continue having an ironclad relationship between our nation and Israel moving forward if our leader is Kamala Harris?
No, because there's way too much pressure. Look, even with President Biden, who I do trust is a Zionist, as he claims. And the reason I say that is because that is what he has done for many decades throughout his presidency. And I know a lot of people will push back on this, but hear me out. There has been so much pressure that even if his baseline was to be a Zionist and believe that Israel should exist, the pressure that he inherited from the Obama days in appeasing Iran's regime and releasing billions of dollars automatically disqualifies him as a Zionist. You worked against Israel and you emboldened and you enriched their main enemy. How does Hezbollah have all the monies and the missiles right now? How does Hamas have the ability to do what they did? How did Russia have the audacity to enter Ukraine? These are all great questions. And the answer to that is that when you have a weak foreign policy, when you have a leader in office who does not lead A and B is always teetering because of the pressure from left-wing voices, not Democrats, but left-wing fringe voices within your party, that's not a leader. And Kamala Harris, I believe, is much more dangerous, actually, than President Biden, because President Biden actually has years and years of experience. I think at the root of it, he does understand foreign policy. He does understand that Hezbollah and Hamas are enemies of the United States. That's why they are on the terror list. And if he did appease Iran's regime, it's because of, again, his time during the Obama administration, and then having that pressure because now you already invited the beast into the White House and you have all sorts of elements and you compromise. You're basically compromised. And that's what has happened under Biden's administration. We will see a further, if it's even possible, further moving to the left and further appeasing and pandering to our enemies, very unfortunately, including Iran's regime under a Kamala Harris presidency. And that is really the truth of it. We're seeing it already. Her skipping out on Bibi Netanyahu's speech is a very clear example of where she would be headed.
Yeah, and you're not the only one who feels that way when it comes to when you say, that Kamala Harris would be much more dangerous than a Biden presidency. And now I'm interested to hear your take on this, because what happens if you take an ally and partner like Israel, and based on what Kamala Harris has done during this visit with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, what happens when you keep Israel at an arm's length? What kind of repercussions could come from something like that?
Right. So there's two wars we're fighting right now. And I say we, it's because it's really terrorists against the free world. It's Iran's regime against the free world. And they have their eyes set on the big Satan, the United States, and the little Satan, Israel. The war in the Middle East has already been jeopardized because of this distance between the White House and Israel. That's because Bibi Netanyahu, the IDF, they have to constantly wait for a nod from the White House. And that has not always been steadfast. Yes, we told Israel, we think you should go and decimate Hamas. We believe that you have every right to, but then there's some teetering on that, right? We tried to micromanage their war. We tried to tell them they're being too harsh. How can you be too harsh with an enemy that wants you off the map? How can you be too harsh with an enemy that comes in and rapes your women and takes hostages? American hostages are still being held. And we did not hear a clear and concise and really declarative statement from the White House to release at least the American hostages, if not all the hostages. So there is absolutely consequences to the military war in the Middle East. Now let's talk about the other war, the war that we're having right here on American soil. Right now, where you are in Washington, D.C., there are thousands of protesters on the streets. You don't see one American flag. What do you see? Hamas outfits. You see Hezbollah outfits. You see Americans on the streets dressed like the enemies who want Americans dead. Now, that is a consequence to the daylight that has been created. That is a consequence to the environment that this administration has created. The media, likewise, siding with terrorists and not taking a clear position to stand steadfastly behind our ally who is fighting this fight for us in the Middle East. And that is why we're losing the information war. And that is why you have, again, American protesters on the streets actually burning American flags. And, this is something that will have far long-lasting consequences, longer than the actual military war will be the animosity and this what we've allowed to unveil itself is this pro-terror, anti-American sentiment that has been unleashed on the streets of America, and that will far outlast any war in the Middle East.
Experts have always been saying that, if this keeps up, if this continues, we could be seeing a second 9/11 on our soil, and I'm very terrified to see what that would take to get to that point. And Lisa, you've always said that this is multiple; these are just multiple wars. I mean, you not only have the war with our enemies, but you also have the war against the media that's been pushing this kind of information. And I always think that's such a smart argument to make. And Lisa, before we go, I want to get your take very quickly on what's happening as it involves some of our enemies in Iran. You briefly mentioned the head of the snake when it comes to this, and it's getting extremely close to producing weapons based on the fact that it's got material for nuclear weapons. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that we are not in a good place right now. What are the dangers of the Biden administration seemingly kind of putting Iran on the back burner, it seems, as this is currently developing?
Not on the back burner, actually, yes, because they try to create this Iran's not responsible kind of attitude, but the Islamic Republic, which is the regime inside Iran, has executed what it is, 3 per day on average, of their own peaceful protesters. Their own university students can't come out and speak freely, but then they try to pander and they support financially and organize the protests on our campuses here in the United States. Look, there has been a huge danger. When we talk about nuclear weapons, because I want to get to your specific question, we assume they're right around the corner from the bomb if they don't have it already. That was the last missing piece to Iran's regime truly feeling emboldened. Look, without the bomb, look what they've done to the Middle East. Look at how many proxies, the fact that they're shooting at U.S. carriers in the Red Sea, the fact that the Houthis are really working against the United States, Hezbollah, the same thing, Hamas, the same thing. You have insurgencies in Syria and Iraq as well. Why would any U.S. administration, again, work against U.S. interests and embolden them further to have a bomb, to have billions of dollars to go on these terror shopping sprees around the region? Look, we didn't, in the last 45 years that the Islamic Republic has occupied Iran and its people, the United States did not minimize that threat. If anything, that threat grew and grew and grew, and it did not only grow into the Middle East, it came right here onto American soil. They're in our universities, they are in our labs, they are funding protests on our streets. They have lobbies that go into the White House regularly and tell our president and our Secretary of State what to do. We are compromised by Iran's regime. So that is the main consequence. That is the threat of emboldening and enriching Iran's regime to the point that we have right now. And any administration, whether it's Trump or Kamala, will have a very hard time ridding ourselves, even if the policy shifts. If it's Trump and the policy pivots from not appeasing Iran's regime, we will still have a very hard time picking out and really detecting the influence that they have here across the board in so many of our private and public sectors.
Well, I'm very glad that you corrected me on this, because we haven't heard from the president involving this issue for quite some time now. We actually haven't heard the president address it at all. We haven't had a press briefing, so a lot of us are left in the dark over this. So I'm glad you're bringing this to light. And, you know, we haven't had President Biden speaking about anything much because he was allegedly diagnosed with COVID last week. I mean, it was a very quiet White House. Not much coming out of it. A lot of us felt like we were left in the dark with this administration, considering that, you know, we just don't really know what's going on with President Biden. Is he okay? Is he medically okay? Are we safe? So walk us through some of the risks involved in just a leader leaving his post in this way, especially, you know, when one of the biggest threats in the Middle East.
Right. So, I mean, look, in terms of policy, he's been absent for a very long time, and our enemies are very smart. Look at China's aggression in that region of the world. You can look at North Korea. You can look at Venezuela. You can look at, of course, Iran's regime being the main example there. And of course, they're watching. They're watching very, very intently. Another very, very important vulnerability here that has grown is, of course, our southern and northern borders, allowing very, very malignant forces to take advantage of that. We have, you know, Afghan terrorists. We have, you know, from the Taliban. We have people from China coming through the border. You have people from Syria and Iran's regime coming through the border. It's not just people from South and Central America who are looking for a better life. And that is the threat. When you couple that with the fact that these terror organizations are now well funded by Iran's regime, you know, it's a perfect storm for another 9/11. Look, this is vulnerability. Vulnerability is not a right or left issue. It is an American issue. And that is something that people really have to pay attention to. And to the point of Iran's regime, you know, President Obama wanted the Iran nuclear deal. He thought of it as the crown jewel of his foreign policy. It really summarized, it was his main accomplishment in terms of his foreign policy while he was in office. President Biden wanted to come in and do the same thing because President Trump withdrew from that deal in 2018. Now, President Biden ran into a lot of obstacles because on the face of it, it's very hard to say we want to get back into a deal with a regime that is executing people and supporting terrorism and threatening the United States openly. But what did they do? They did that behind the scenes. They appeased them. They enriched them behind the scenes. They took off vital sanctions. They allowed them to sell oil to China and Venezuela and others. They allowed them to sell drones to Russia and other weapons parts to other countries. That is how they work behind the scenes to really make America much more vulnerable than it ever was 4 years ago. And that's what we're dealing with. So I know foreign policy is not the main issue for many Americans because we have to put food on the table, we have to put gas in our cars, and we have to have jobs. But foreign policy is extremely important because it relates very directly to our national security, how safe we are here at home. It relates directly to our economy. It relates directly to our trade partners and how safe we are and how we are viewed across the world. So think twice when you go to the polls this November.
Absolutely. That's very well said. And not many people realize just the chain reaction that foreign policy really has on our everyday lives. Lisa Daftari, Middle East expert and editor-in-chief of the Foreign Desk, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.